Broadcasting from New York City to the world, it's the G-Man Interviews.
Welcome. My guest is Stuart Wexler, a historian who has devoted the past 10 years of his research to domestic terrorism in the United States. Mr. Wexler is a history teacher who earned his BA in history from Tulane University and has just completed his master's in political science from Rutgers University under the prestigious James Madison Fellowship. His research has been featured in the Boston Globe, Salon, Newsweek, the Mississippi-Clarion Ledge, and on the Thom Hartman and Mark Thompson shows, to name a few. According to the critically acclaimed author and lecturer, his groundbreaking 2012 book, The Awful Grace of God, Religious Terrorism, White Supremacy, and the Unsolved Murder of Martin Luther King Jr., Counterpoint, which he co-authored with Larry Hancock, allowed him to have a better understanding of how a network of religious zealots created an informal proto-social network under the umbrella of a little-known but important ideology, Christian identity. In tracing this network through the 1960s, it became clear that they may have had their hand in a number of different racial crimes. This revelation served as the catalyst for his new book, America's Secret Jihad, which will be released in August. He spent the next several months examining that proposition, while helping Hancock with another book, Shadow Warfare, America's History of Undeclared Wars. This emerged out of their long-time mutual interest in the history of covert operations in the 1960s, although they trace such activity all the way back just before World War II and on through the current war on terrorism. Larry led the charge on that book, while I continued to investigate the Christian Identity Network and continued my work on the Martin Luther King Jr. assassination, said Wexler. We eventually published what you might call an abridged version of The Awful Grace of God as an e-book and called it Killing King. His work on the Birmingham bombing also became a very small e-book, Rebels, Red Baiters, and Religious Radicals. For the past several years, he has written a number of extended essays on isolated historical crimes and their connection to the Christian identity ideology. He filed Freedom of Information requests, visited archives in Alabama and Mississippi, and data mined newly released information made available through various online networks and resources. He published an article in the Mississippi-Clarion Ledge on the Mississippi burning murders, which received praise from noted historians and the general public. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the show, Mr. Wexler.
Hi, Gary. Thank you for having me on.
You traced the Christian Identity Network as far back as the 1960s. What is it, where did it originate, and whom did it consist of?
Christian Identity actually has a pedigree and a lineage that goes back all the way to the 19th century, and it starts as something called British Israelism, which is basically just an Anglo-chauvinist take on the Bible, which argues that Anglo-Saxons and white Europeans are the chosen people. But it doesn't necessarily denigrate Jews and blacks. What happens is as it transfers over across the Atlantic to the United States, it comes, 1900s to 1930s, it starts to spread British Israelism at a time when America is moving in an even more chauvinistic, racist direction. The Klan in the 1920s was the largest fraternal organization in the country. You had millions of members in multiple states, not just the South. And it had not just been, it wasn't just anymore just anti-black. It was very much now anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, and anti-Jewish. And so this religion starts to evolve. And by the time World War II ends, you get essentially the codified version of what we call now Christian identity, which is basically the idea that the story in the Garden of Eden is a very different one in their telling. In their interpretation, there was two conjugal relations. Eve had a relationship with the serpent, in other words, the devil, and Jews are really the offspring of the devil. They're not the chosen people. They're imposters. People of color are children of the beasts of the field, so they're subhuman. And their telling of the rest of, I guess you would say biblical history, is that the Jews have been engaged in a cosmic conspiracy for several millennia now to manipulate people of color against the true chosen people who are white Europeans. And this really takes shape in Southern California in the late 1940s. It builds into other parts of the country on through the 50s until in the late 1950s you start getting groups that are actually dedicated to its precepts. And the biggest precept that motivates the network that I'm concerned with is the desire to start a race war. So what they want is they want to inflame. They want to provoke. And that's ultimately the network it's still headquartered at this point in time in the 1950s and 60s in Southern California with a gentleman specifically by the name of Wesley Swift who created something called the Church of Jesus Christ Christian. But the ideology begins to take hold amongst his followers. They take his tapes of his sermons and they spread them nationwide. And so he starts to gain traction in other groups. The anti-Semitism, I don't know if this is what you would call a silver lining or not, but the anti-Semitism does not take hold with the wider racist audience in the 1950s and 60s. One of the guys I write about, J.B. Stoner, head of the National States' Rights Party, he was at one point actually kicked out of a Klan group because he was too anti-Semitic. So what these folks start to do, and this becomes the pattern over time, is they start to adjust their message to sort of appropriate different groups that align with their ideology but don't embrace the entire ideology. And that's why they've been missed. That's why scholars have missed their association with violence in the 60s and 70s, is because these people are becoming the head of Ku Klux Klan groups. The rank and file members don't buy in. The leaders have to manipulate those rank and file members.
Many white supremacists consider William L. Pierce to be the face of the movement, which is largely due to the enormous popularity of his book, The Turner Diaries. Would I be correct in stating that Wesley Swift was considered the father of the Christian identity movement?
Yes, and it's interesting to bring up Pierce, who plays a role in my book, America's Secret Jihad. Swift predates Pierce. And what happens with Christian identity is it begins to sort of influence other religions and other ideologies. So Pierce, his ideology is something called cosmotheism. It's like deism for white supremacists. And you can look at the scholarship on Christian identity. Most scholars will say there's basically almost no difference between the kinds of things Pierce was advocating and the kind of things Wesley Swift was advocating. Most recognize that there's a strong influence there. So it may seem different, but it's actually all from the same cloth.
What would you cite as the principal reason why the network has been able to survive and even thrive for over 50 years?
I think there's two things that are going on there. One is what I referenced before. They're able to survive and thrive in part because they figured out that they can link into and appropriate or repurpose all sorts of other sort of ultra-right groups. So if they find an anti-tax, anti-government group, well, that's part of their message too. So they have no problem aligning themselves with those groups. And then the other element of it is that they hide themselves behind that front. So they have this amazing ability to adapt, and that's organic. That's not like necessarily a conscious thing that somebody's thinking about in some room somewhere. It's just the nature of the ideology that it can adapt. But the leaders within these groups, they don't go around advertising, I am Christian identity. They just take advantage of those groups for violence and political agitation because it's consistent with their ideology. And people have missed it because when they see, say, a KKK attack, they'd be right in assuming, because most of the time it is, it's just a bunch of neo-Confederates. They hate integration. They don't look the second level beyond and ask, okay, so what about the guy who ordered that? What's his agenda? They take the simple explanation up front and they don't look any further. And that's why they've been able to thrive, because they've been largely unaccountable for their actions.
As far as the threat it poses to America, is the network as dangerous as it was when first formed, or has it transformed into something far more dangerous and sinister?
Well, I guess that's sort of an eye of the beholder. Which devil would you rather deal with? In the 60s, it was more organized, and it was more conspiratorial and plotted, right? So the acts there was a coordination to it and a organization to it. The combined efforts of law enforcement have kind of limited the influence and the ability of these groups to organize in any cohesive, coherent way. And the ultimate result of that, and this is very much planned, is to become more and more decentralized. And so now what you're dealing with are lone wolf and small cell-based violence. Now, the advantage of that, if there's such a thing as an advantage of that, is it's very difficult for groups like that to plan anything large-scale, multi-state coordinated the way they could in the 1960s. The flip is it's almost impossible to stop that kind of violence. And thus you get somebody like Dylann Roof, who I wouldn't contend is directly Christian identity, but is very much influenced by that ideology.
What was the most deeply disturbing and frightening fact you uncovered while writing America's Secret Jihad?
The book basically shows that a number of the worst instances of especially racial violence in American history, I mean, stuff that would be well known to virtually anybody, was planned or was part of the agenda for this group. And that's super disturbing to me, because not only is it the actual act and the victims and the terroristic aspects to it, but that these folks have escaped scrutiny despite the fact that they've been a part of those kinds of acts. And that's really disturbing to me.
Would the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 be an example of what you're referring to?
Absolutely. So one of the chapters of my book deals with this. I've dealt with it in other places. Largely unknown, members of this group, they magically show up to Birmingham the day before the attacks. They're very close with the National States Rights Party, which people always associate the people in this group with the Klan, the actual perpetrators of the bombing, but they were more closely associated with the National States Rights Party. And these folks tried to do stuff, and it's detailed in the book, after the attack also, which is part of the modus operandi. The thing that makes these guys different, and which is why they're ideological religious terrorists, is their goal is to inflame. Somebody might say, and some of the people in the Klan did say after the church bombing in 1963 in Birmingham, we just made a big mistake. It wasn't our intent to kill those 4 girls, and look at the PR disaster that's going to result of this. The folks I'm talking about, they see it the complete opposite direction. They see it, okay, let's see what we can do to pour gasoline on this fire. And that's pretty consistent in their behavior.
You said their goal is to inflame and start a race war.
Mm-hmm.
If that's the case, do you believe, based on the research you conducted, that there's a connection between the unprecedented number of unarmed African American men that have been shot and killed by police and the Christian Identity Network? In other words, did you come across anything that led you to believe they could be infiltrating police departments throughout the country?
A couple things. My book is mostly history, so I completed it around the time this rash of shootings started to happen. One thing that's very evident, they were major parts of police departments 60s, 70s. I mean, that's without dispute. I have recently heard, it's ironic, the third person in the span of 4 days who has brought this to my attention or raised the possibility that they're making a more concerted effort to infiltrate police agencies. Now, we know that they've been consciously infiltrating the military. It would not shock me if they're consciously trying to infiltrate the police. And if they were, what you're describing is exactly the kind of thing you'd be worried about. If they could convince somebody who did that to then go, shoot an African American in the back in a town where there was already racial tension, sure, that's the kind of thing that's very much give you an idea just how sort of devious these people have been in the past. One group that was highly infiltrated by them, to the point where you couldn't even say they were infiltrated because the leadership was almost all members of Christian identity, was the 1960s Minutemen. Stockpiled weapons out like crazy, like disturbing levels. One of the things they did is in the height of the urban race riots of the 1960s, they faked and manufactured fake literature on behalf of the black nationals, specifically the Black Panthers, and would go through black neighborhoods that were experiencing riot situations, and they would throw these pamphlets out the windows, and they were encouragement for the people to riot more. So they're very devious. They're not anybody that I would not put past them the idea that you should raise the stakes that way. My bigger concern for a while now, and it's especially the case right now, is, and I don't even like to say it on the air, because I don't want to even put the bad karma out there. But if they're looking to do what they've done in the past, I worry about the safety of President Obama. I've never been more worried than I am in the wake of what happened in South Carolina, and not just South Carolina, the events that you're talking about. Because the history of the people I investigate is when they're confounded, like when they can't get it, they don't get the fact that the people they think are subhuman are actually more restrained and compassionate than they could ever hope to be, right? They don't get that. They constantly are trying to figure out, well, how can we push the people over the edge? Even with rank-and-file, non-KKK white people, they're constantly trying to figure out, how can we polarize the races and get this cycle of violence going? And almost no media attention, but anyone can go out and verify that somebody stole an FBI sniper rifle out of a car when President Obama was visiting Utah. That scares the heck out of me, because I've been in the minds of these people and how they think about how to provoke, and it pains me to even put myself in their position. I doubt they're listening to the show, but it doesn't take rocket scientists, unfortunately, to think about what's the one thing you could do that might put people over the edge.
Former Klansman Scott Shepard has appeared on this show several times to discuss the Ku Klux Klan and the white supremacist movement. In one of the episodes, he talked about how the White Citizens Council, which he described as a racist organization that he was a member of, is now operating under the moniker of the Council of Conservative Citizens. He also stated many white-collar professionals, like doctors, high-ranking officials, and lawyers, provide enormous amounts of money, anonymously, to politicians and organizations that secretly support the white supremacist agenda. Several seconds after he made that statement about the anonymous donations, one thing immediately came to mind: the Citizens United ruling. When you were conducting your research for your book, did you ever come across anything that led you to believe there was a correlation between the Christian Identity Network, the Council of Conservative Citizens, ALEC, or the American Legislative Exchange Council, and so-called dark money campaign contributions?
Well, I take things separately there. In terms of Christian Identity and the Council of Conservative Citizens, it gets a little bit involved, but there is definitely a connection. Is there an overt connection? It's not explicit. It's not the kind of connection that I argue in my book you'd see with the National States Rights Party. Let me just give you one example. You take the guy who wrote or designed the website that appears to have helped inflame Dylann Roof. He is not Christian Identity. He appears to be a racist Odinist or racist neo-pagan. And you say, well, that's different. Except that when you look at the history of racist neo-paganism, the person who gave the intellectual juice to that was a guy named James Warner, who was a minister in the Christian Identity Church. The fact that they're so darn similar is not an accident. So you see the influence that way. A guy who came out the week after the tragedy in Charleston, and he gave one of these two-faced responses of, oh, we reject the violence, oh, but Dylan Roof, he's a hero. Trying to make sense of that in my head. But investigate him a little bit. Turns out he speaks at the Council of Conservative Citizens national meetings, and then you start looking at his rhetoric, and it's pretty darn obvious he is something like a Christian identity believer when you hear his rhetoric about Jews. So you just have to dig a few layers, and you can see the influence there. Now, when you take it beyond there, I did not find any evidence in my research to connect it to ALEC or to connect it to dark money, but of course the very nature of dark money is it would be incredibly difficult to follow. And that's, part of the disturbing element of the nature of the campaign finances. If you have something like dark money, it's very difficult to know that if there's an ulterior agenda to some of these people who are funding campaigns. There is evidence that groups like the Council of Conservative Citizens have overtly given money to political campaigns. And you're starting to see, and you hope it will continue, that folks will say, sorry, we don't want your money anymore.
In the wake of the Charleston, South Carolina killings and recent arson cases involving historically black churches, clergy members from across the country and of all faiths have banded together in effort to convey that evil and hatred will not prevail. This being the case, are you confident that the so-called Christian Identity Network will still be able to accomplish its objectives going forward?
In a sense, thankfully, they've never been able to complete their objective going forward because they constantly are counting on, especially a lack of restraint in the African-American community, and they always get confounded by the fact that no, African-Americans are not revolting in the streets. And that's their goal. I mean, their goal is a race war. So that I would say no, but here's why people need to take one more step further in their analysis. The Klan group that's going to be holding the rally, I think it's on the 18th, two things about that group that have not gotten nearly the attention that they deserve. One is that you can find video on their website of them in paramilitary training for a race war. And two, if you dig deeply enough in their website, and I have, they are clearly Christian identity. At least their leadership or whoever's in charge of that website is. It's not the first thing people will see, and that's always the case because they don't want even the initial recruits to see it because it's so foreign. But if you dig deep enough on their website, you'll find the relevant passages that would make anybody who's a scholar of Christian identity realize that's what this group is doing. So when I hear people say, oh, they're just using this as a recruiting tool, I would argue, maybe some of them are, but there's clearly people in that group who want to inflame. They want to pour gasoline on the race issue in South Carolina. Now, I think they'll fail because they fail pretty consistently. But that's their agenda. So I think the answer to your question is they're going to keep on pursuing their agenda because people don't recognize their agenda.
As this interview is being conducted, the Confederate flag is being removed from the state capitol building in South Carolina. The flag has served as a symbol for the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacist movement for generations. As one of the country's foremost experts on domestic terrorism, do you suspect there will be some form of retaliation on a grand scale after the flag is removed?
My fear would be that the first element you have to see before these folks, and this is just based on historical precedent, they like to see the grievances and anger on the parts of everyday whites first. If that were to happen, if there were to be, for instance, not a protest of the Klan, but a protest of, Daughters of the American Revolution or somebody to what happened to the Confederate flag, then I'd be worried that these folks might try and do something to really make something bad happen. The case study in that, like the sort of example, would be what happened at Ole Miss when James Meredith came to town and tried to integrate Ole Miss. These guys were right there on the scene. It doesn't get nearly enough attention in the history books. What were they there for? They saw their opportunity to really get the everyday white Southerner to be violent. It's one thing to get a Klan member to do it. It's another thing to get somebody, who lives in a suburb somewhere to do it. That would be my fear. If you get a pushback by everyday Americans against the Confederate flag coming down, that's when I think these kinds of guys would strike.
How can people purchase your book or contact you for more information?
The book is available for pre-order at Amazon. It's called America's Secret Jihad. You can go there right now. I'm in the process of putting up a regular web page for it, which the book is coming out in August. I have a Facebook page for it. You can find me on Facebook and friend me. And in terms of contacting me, you send me an email. I'm at swexler2@hotmail.com or wexteach@gmail.com. I'm happy to talk with anybody about it who's wanting to do additional research. If I could make an appeal to your audience, though, where this goes for me, besides the fact that I want to raise consciousness about this group, is a lot of the crimes that I examine in the book are crimes where there's still more people who can go to jail for them. There's still evidence that hasn't been released. And the Justice Department and the Congress, to their credit, created an initiative to go after cold cases in the Civil Rights era. But that initiative has not yielded pretty much anything. And I fear, for reasons that I go into in the book, that it may be fatally flawed in the sense that the FBI and the Department of Justice may not be willing to dig very far into their own history of infiltrating these groups and the compromising positions it placed them in. So I would love to ask your audience, contact your congressperson, contact your senators, and ask them to get behind a bill that will create a review board that will release this information to the public and force the release of this information to the public so that independent investigators can try and close these cases and give them one last shot. If this thing goes away, and it appears to be doing so, with just a Justice Department investigation, I feel we're going to figure out not too long after that that was a mistake. We got to democratize it and let the everyday person push and try and figure out what happened.
It's been an honor having you on the show, Mr. Wexler. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on, Gary.